Hey guys, welcome back for another episode of The Suited Shootist. Today, we are talking about worst case scenarios. Kind of. What do I mean by that? Well, think about it this way. It's not uncommon to hear, whenever the topic of defensive carry comes up, that it's recommended you carry the most optimal setup possible for the sentinel events, the 30, 40 yard shot inside the mall, or the headshot on a moving target inside a crowded church, those the types of defensive encounters that make the news. And the logic being is that if you are prepared for those much more challenging types of situations, then if you find yourself in a more typical, parking lot mugging, then that's going to be an easy day for you. And as such, the equipment that tends to be recommended are going to be the larger guns that are easy to shoot, higher capacity, more user-friendly, and all this other jazz. And it's interesting, and I fully concede that some of my bias is creeping in here, but it strikes me as a little bit ironic that the intellectual exercise here accepts the idea of a worst-case scenario, and yet the supposition is always that you have the luxury of building your wardrobe in such a way that it accommodates your optimal gear. Now, if someone genuinely has a lifestyle that allows them to dress around the gun in that capacity, awesome. And if that's how they choose to structure their defensive program, and that's what they want to make the priority, fantastic. However, it strikes me as interesting that they are willing to accept the idea of a challenging scenario from an outside perspective. And yet, when the idea comes up of learning how to actually work with defensive tools in a less forgiving wardrobe, that tends to get dismissed as either superfluous or either overthinking or, oh, well, that never happens. And that's where I want to give the pushback. And here's why. If you take kind of the numbers, for example, when I took the Rangemaster Instructor class, the way Tom Given ran the math, the average adult in the U.S. has in their lifetime approximately about a 1 in 4 chance of being the focus of violent crime at some point. Now, those are not small odds by any stretch of the imagination. But again, when you look at what's typical, that still tends to be a once-in-a-lifetime type of event, unless you're Lance Thomas, for example. But again, in that circumstance, slightly more high risk because, not only the era, but jeweler dealing with a lot of very high-value inventory. So that's not necessarily the case for a lot of people. And so, folks are willing to spend a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort preparing for what is, for all intents and purposes, a once-in-a-lifetime type of event, admittedly with incredibly high stakes. And yet, I don't think a single year has gone by, with the exception of, 2020 through 2022, that I wasn't called on at least once to attend some kind of function that necessitated a jacket and tie or some more formal level of dress than is my day to day. And I think that it's really important to look at that because, again, I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to live their life with a deep carried .22 snub revolver by any stretch of the imagination. Everybody's context is different. However, there seems to be this sort of intellectual disconnect in my mind where if you are going to accept the potential for a worst case scenario of a high accountability, low probability shot in public, then why not take a little bit of time and a little bit of effort to learn how to, sort of navigate the social situations that require an unspoken dress code that is outside of your normal familiarity. Because, number one, the reality is that dress clothes are not very forgiving for concealed carry, whether it just be actually accommodating the tools, or, this kind of stuff kind of sucks for fighting in too. Anytime you're talking about dress shirts, for example, these types of woven fabrics tend not to stretch. And so, your preferred draw technique, for example, may not work the way that you expect it to in a button-up Oxford shirt the same way that it does in your favorite t-shirt. And those are things that you need to be aware of. So again, I'm not sitting here saying that people need to live their life in a suit and tie by any stretch of the imagination. However, just looking at the principles of it, if a relatively infrequent event is possible at some point in your future that requires a certain amount of technical proficiency to execute well, is it not in your best interest to spend a little bit of time and a little bit of effort developing a base level of competency so that you're not having to figure it out in the moment? Whenever you take that concept and you apply it to carrying a firearm, everybody's, just clamoring on board. It's like, yeah, well, absolutely. When you apply that exact same statement to, hey, it may be worth understanding how your clothes are supposed to fit and why you shouldn't be wearing, these two things together because it just makes you stick out like a sore thumb. Like, well, that crap doesn't matter. Yeah, no, the stakes are not the same by any stretch of the imagination. You have, minor social faux pas versus a life and death encounter. So I'm not trying to say they're the same thing by any stretch. But in the same vein, I've had a lot more encounters in my life where I've had to wear a jacket and tie than I ever have. Thankfully, I've yet to encounter a circumstance where I've been called on to draw a pistol. So it's not necessarily applicable to everybody. That being said, I definitely think that it is a higher value skill set than a lot of people will sort of attribute to it. And yeah, it takes a little time. It takes a little effort, but again, I'm not trying to get people to like A class or GM level, sartorial competency here. I'm trying to get people into C class. That's it. And it doesn't really take that much effort to get there. So I'm just trying to highlight the balance here, because if you are preparing for that worst case scenario gunfight, who's to say that you are going to be in a position where you get to wear your favorite range gear that gives you the mobility and just, the dexterity to hit that sub-second draw? If you need to understand the limitations of your marksmanship and your gun handling, it's probably worth understanding the limitations that your clothing can play into that as well. Because I've said this before, regardless of what it is that you are wearing, your clothing is part of your EDC, because it can either help or it can hinder. And if you don't know which one it is, then it's a liability. So if there's questions on how to refine this skill, I want to hear about that down in the comments. If you have found that, some article of clothing of yours was either surprisingly friendly or surprisingly hostile to your concealed carry, I want to hear about that too. So let me know. Other than that, hope everybody has a fantastic week. Stay dangerous and stay sharp.